The message came on a Tuesday morning, and nobody on Earth took it seriously at first. It was short. It was cold. It came through a frequency that human scientists had been monitoring for decades without ever receiving a single signal. The translation took 3 hours, and when it was done, the lead analyst at the global signal station, a quiet man named Greg Payne, read it twice before calling his supervisor. The message said that humanity had been granted an invitation to attend the interstellar summit of the Galactic Conclave, to be held aboard the station known as the Veth Prime Assembly, located near the edge of the Orion Arm. It said that humanity had 30 days to send a delegation. It said nothing else. Within a week, every government on Earth knew about it. Within 2 weeks, the arguments had already started. Some leaders wanted to send a military force. Some wanted to send scientists. Some wanted to ignore the invitation entirely and claim it was a hoax. But in the end, a decision was made. Earth would send 3 people. A soldier who knew how to talk. A scientist who knew how to listen. And another soldier who knew how to watch. Colonel Ryan Holt was chosen to lead the delegation. He was 44 years old, lean, and had a face that looked like it had seen too many long nights and not enough good meals. He had spent 20 years as a field officer and another 6 as a military diplomat, moving between war zones and peace talks with equal comfort. He did not smile often, but when he did, people tended to feel like they had missed something important. He accepted the assignment without asking many questions. He packed light. Dr. Laura Sims was the second member. She was 38, with dark eyes that moved fast and a habit of writing notes on her hand when she could not find paper. She had spent her career studying alien signal patterns, building language models for non-human communication, and publishing papers that most of her colleagues were only just beginning to understand. She had never left Earth's orbit before. When the assignment came, she said yes before the official offer was even finished. Commander Derek Cole was the third. He was 36 and built like someone had put a wall in a uniform. He said very little, noticed everything, and had a reputation among the people who worked with him for being the calmest person in any bad situation. His job on this mission was simple: keep Ryan and Laura alive, and make sure the human delegation did not get embarrassed in front of the galaxy. He took the job the same way he took everything, without drama and without hesitation. They left Earth on a clear morning aboard a ship called the Ardent, a mid-sized deep space vessel that had been cleaned up and given a fresh coat of paint for the occasion. It was not a warship. It was not a luxury cruiser. It was practical and solid, and it moved through space with quiet efficiency. The 3 of them spent the long transit reading everything that had been gathered about the conclave, its member civilizations, its history, its structure, and the little that was known about the species they would be meeting. The Drethuli were the most powerful. They were tall, scaled, and ancient, with a history of conquest that stretched back further than human civilization. They controlled the most warships, the most territory, and the most votes on the Conclave Council. Their leader at the summit was a delegate named Vrethik, a creature that stood nearly 3 meters tall and had ruled his faction for over 200 years. He was known for his patience, his intelligence, and his complete and open contempt for younger species. There were 16 other civilizations in the conclave. Some were peaceful traders. Some were scientists. A few had military power worth noting. But all of them, according to the briefing files, had been watching humanity from a careful distance for a long time. And not one of them had expected humans to survive long enough to receive an invitation. When the Ardent finally docked at the Veth Prime Assembly, Ryan stood at the airlock and looked out through the small porthole at the station beyond. It was enormous. It made the Ardent look like a piece of dust floating beside a mountain. Hundreds of ships from dozens of species were docked along its arms, each one larger and more impressive than the last. The station itself was lit up with moving light patterns that Laura said were a form of public communication, announcements, greetings, protocols broadcast to every vessel arriving. None of the announcements mentioned the human ship. They walked out of the airlock and into the main receiving corridor, and the reaction was immediate. The corridor was wide and full of alien delegates, staff, and observers from across the galaxy, all moving between sections and speaking in a dozen different languages. When the 3 humans stepped out, heads turned. Not in welcome. Not in curiosity. In something much closer to amusement. A Drethuli official near the entrance said something to the creature beside him, and both of them made a sound that the translator in Ryan's earpiece identified as laughter. Laura heard it too. Her jaw tightened slightly, but she kept walking. Derek had already swept the corridor with his eyes and was tracking 4 security personnel near the far wall who had positioned themselves facing the human group. Ryan smiled. Not at anyone in particular. Just a slow, easy smile, as if this was exactly where he had expected to be, and he was perfectly comfortable with all of it. A low-ranking conclave staffer, a small gray-skinned creature with 4 arms, approached them and introduced himself as their assigned guide for the summit. His name was hard to pronounce, so Laura quietly named him Pip in her notes. Pip explained in clipped, formal language that the summit would begin the following morning. Each civilization would be given time to present its standing to the council. Humanity would go last. Ryan thanked him politely. Pip looked surprised that Ryan could speak Galactic Standard at all. As Pip led them through the corridors toward their assigned quarters, Ryan watched the station around him with quiet attention. He noticed which species traveled in groups and which traveled alone. He noticed which delegates carried weapons openly and which kept them hidden. He noticed the way certain corridors were wider and better lit, and how others were narrow and overlooked. He stored all of it. That night, sitting in the small common room of their guest quarters, the 3 of them talked. Laura went over the presentation she had been preparing for weeks. Derek said little but asked sharp questions about the layout of the presentation chamber. Ryan sat back and listened to both of them, and at the end he said only one thing. He said that every species out there expected humanity to come here and be grateful. They expected humans to be small and careful and eager to impress. They expected the delegation to feel lucky just to be in the room. Derek looked at him. Laura looked at him. Ryan said that was fine. Let them think that. Let them laugh and make their little jokes and feel comfortable in what they believed they already knew. Because the most dangerous moment for anyone was not when they were afraid of you. It was when they were certain there was nothing to be afraid of at all. He finished his coffee, stood up, and told them both to get some sleep. Tomorrow was going to be a long day. The presentation chamber of the Veth Prime Assembly was the largest room any of the 3 humans had ever stood in. It was shaped like a bowl, wide at the top and narrowing toward the floor where the presentation platform stood. The walls curved upward in layers, each level filled with seating for delegates, observers, and officials from across the conclave. The ceiling was so high it was lost in soft blue light. Every seat was full. Thousands of alien eyes looked down at the platform from every direction, and the sound of so many different species breathing and murmuring and shifting in their seats created a low, constant hum that filled the entire space. Ryan stood at the edge of the entrance hall with Laura and Derek, waiting for their turn. The presentations had been going on since early morning. Each civilization walked to the platform, activated the display system at the center, and filled the chamber with whatever they most wanted the galaxy to see. The Corati showed their trade network, hundreds of shipping lanes mapped across the galaxy in golden light, moving goods between 40 star systems. The Velis showed their medical technology, including a cure for a disease that had wiped out 2 other species before the Velis shared the treatment freely. Each presentation was polished, impressive, and received with the appropriate level of respect. Then the Drethali went. Vrethik walked to the platform alone. He did not bring advisors or assistants. He moved slowly, deliberately, in the way that very powerful creatures sometimes moved, not because they were slow, but because they had no reason to hurry. He was enormous up close. His scales were deep green and gray, layered like armor, and his eyes were the color of old copper. He looked at the chamber the way someone looks at a room they already own. He activated the display without a word. What filled the chamber was not graphs or trade routes or medical charts. It was a fleet. A holographic projection of the Drethali Armada spread across the entire presentation space from floor to ceiling, filling every corner of the room with warships. They were massive vessels, dark and angular, with weapons systems outlined in red along their hulls. The numbers floated beside each ship type: tonnage, firepower, range, crew capacity. The total count at the bottom of the display read 11,416 active warships. The chamber was completely silent for a moment. Then it erupted. The sound from 11,000 conclave observers rising at once was something that hit the body before it hit the ears. Even Derek, who did not react to much, felt it in his chest. Vrethik stood at the platform with his arms behind his back and let the noise wash over him. He did not smile. He did not need to. When the chamber finally settled, Vrethik spoke for exactly 4 minutes. He described the Drethali's history of expansion, their current territorial control, and their role as the primary military guarantor of Conclave security. He made it sound like a fact of nature, the way gravity was a fact of nature. Then he stepped back from the platform, looked directly at the section of the chamber where the human delegation was seated, and said something in Drethali dialect. Laura's earpiece translated it in real time. He said, "We look forward to seeing what the newcomers have brought." The laughter that followed was not loud. It was the quieter, more comfortable kind, the kind shared between people who all understand the same joke without needing it explained. Ryan heard it. He looked at the chamber, at the thousands of faces, at the way delegates leaned toward each other and made small sounds of amusement. He looked at Vrethik, who had already returned to his seat and was speaking to an aide as if the presentation had not already ended. Ryan stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked to the platform. He did not carry a display unit. He did not have a team of technicians. He carried one small data chip between 2 fingers, and he set it into the display port at the center of the platform with the kind of calm that comes from either complete confidence or complete indifference. The chamber watched him with mild curiosity. The murmuring had not fully stopped. He looked up at the thousands of faces looking down at him and waited. Just for a moment. Long enough that the murmuring faded and the chamber became quiet again, not out of respect but out of simple curiosity about what this small, unimpressive creature was going to do. Then he activated the display. What appeared was a graph. Plain, simple, white lines on a dark background. The title at the top read, "Recorded Casualties in Human Armed Conflict, by Conflict, across 3,000 years of recorded history." The numbers along the vertical axis climbed into the hundreds of millions. The horizontal axis stretched across centuries. Dozens of conflicts were marked along the line, each one a spike, a rise, a devastating peak of destruction. And after each peak, the line did not end. It continued. It kept going. Every single time, it kept going. Ryan did not speak for a moment. He let the graph sit there in the air above the chamber, enormous and quiet, while every delegate in the room looked at the numbers. Then Laura stood at the second microphone position beside the platform and began to speak. She spoke in Drethali dialect, clean and precise, without an accent the translation software could detect. Several delegates sat up straighter at that alone. She explained what the graph showed. She described war after war in simple, factual language. She named the weapons used, the civilizations that fought, the scale of the losses. And then she said the same thing, over and over, for every single conflict on the graph. Humanity survived it. Humanity rebuilt. And then humanity came back stronger than it had been before. She said it without drama. Without emphasis. As a series of facts, delivered calmly, the way a scientist reads data from a test that has already been run and already has results. The chamber was very quiet by the time she finished. Ryan looked at Vrethik. The Drethali delegate was sitting still, his copper eyes fixed on the display. He was not laughing. He was not speaking to his aide. He was reading the numbers. Ryan spoke then, for the first time since stepping to the platform. He said that humanity was not here to impress the conclave. They were not here to ask for anything. They were here because they had been invited, and humans generally showed up when invited. He said that the graph behind him was not a list of failures. It was a record of what humanity had gone through, and more importantly, a record of the fact that it was still here to talk about all of it. He thanked the chamber for their time. Then he pulled the data chip from the port, put it back in his jacket pocket, and walked back to his seat. The chamber did not erupt this time. It did not go silent either. It made a different kind of sound, the low, shifting murmur of thousands of people recalibrating something they had already decided. Derek leaned over to Ryan and spoke quietly. He said that he had counted exactly 9 Drethali security personnel in the room before the presentation, and that during Ryan's time on the platform, 3 of them had stopped watching the exits and started watching Ryan instead. Ryan nodded slowly. He said that was good. That meant they were paying attention. The recess after the morning presentations lasted 2 hours, and it was supposed to be quiet. Delegates were expected to move between the meeting rooms, take meals in the common halls, or return to their quarters for rest before the afternoon session. The Veth Prime Assembly had a full-service staff of hundreds, and the station ran these breaks with the kind of smooth precision that came from hosting 4,000 years of galactic politics. Nothing unexpected was supposed to happen during recess. Nothing unexpected ever had. Ryan was walking back from the delegate dining hall with a cup of something hot that was not quite coffee but was close enough to be acceptable. Laura was 3 steps ahead of him, already reading something on her data pad, her lips moving slightly as she worked through a translation. Derek was behind them both, as he always was, moving with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes tracking every corridor, every doorway, every figure moving through the wide halls of the station. They were on the lower transit level, a section of the station that connected the main presentation areas to the guest quarters, when Derek stopped walking. He did not say anything. He just stopped. And because Derek almost never stopped for no reason, Ryan stopped too, and so did Laura, looking up from her pad with a slight frown. Derek turned his head slowly to the left. Down the corridor in that direction, about 40 meters away, a section of the wall paneling had a thin line of shadow along its base that had not been there 20 minutes ago when they had walked this same path from the other direction. The lighting in this part of the corridor was slightly lower than the rest of the level. The ventilation hum was a tone higher than normal. And a conclave maintenance worker who had been standing near a service panel at the far end of the corridor when they passed the first time was no longer there. Derek said quietly, "Move to the right wall and keep walking." They moved. The attack came 9 seconds later. The wall panels on both sides of the corridor burst open, and figures poured through. They were not conclave security. They wore plain dark gear with no markings, carried compact energy weapons, and moved fast, spreading across the corridor to cut off both directions of travel. Ryan counted them without thinking, 12 from the left, 10 from the right. 22 total, with more sounds coming from the corridor branches ahead. The leader shouted an order in a dialect Laura's earpiece identified as Lower Dretheli street language, not military, not official, the kind of dialect you would use if you wanted your words to be untraceable to any formal source. The order was to take the humans alive, but damage was acceptable. Ryan had already stepped back and turned to put a structural column between himself and the nearest group. Laura had pressed flat against the wall behind him. Neither of them had weapons. That had been a specific condition of their invitation. The human delegation was permitted a security escort of no more than 5 personnel, all weapons to be declared and approved by Conclave protocol. Derek and his 4 escort personnel had declared their weapons. What they had not declared, because it had not been asked about, was how long each of them had been training for situations exactly like this one. Derek moved first. He went toward the larger group on the left, which was the direction every trained defensive instinct said not to go, and that decision alone froze the nearest 3 attackers for just under 2 seconds because it was not what they expected. Derek used those 2 seconds in full. The first attacker went down from a single controlled strike to the nerve cluster below the jaw. The second was redirected into the third before either of them could raise a weapon. By the time the group on the right had covered half the distance to Ryan and Laura, Derek had already created enough chaos in the left group that their formation had collapsed into individuals trying to react rather than a unit trying to execute a plan. The 4 escort personnel moved at the same moment Derek did, splitting across the corridor with quiet efficiency. They did not shout. They did not fire weapons. They worked in pairs, one drawing attention while the other closed distance, and they moved through the attacking group the way water moves through a space, not forcing, not stopping, just finding the path and taking it. It lasted 11 minutes. When it was over, 31 attackers were on the floor of the corridor. Every single one of them was alive. They were restrained using their own gear straps, lined up neatly against the left wall in a row, some still blinking in confusion about what had happened to them. The corridor itself was largely undamaged. A section of wall panel had been broken during the initial breach, and one overhead light was flickering, but otherwise the space looked almost ordinary. Derek walked back to Ryan and Laura, rolling one sleeve back down over his forearm. He had a small cut along his left cheekbone that was already clotting. He did not mention it. Ryan looked at the row of restrained attackers and then looked at Derek. He asked if everyone was all right. Derek said yes. He said one of the escort personnel had a bruised shoulder. He said the attackers had been well funded and well equipped but had clearly expected a different kind of resistance. Laura was already crouched beside the nearest attacker, examining the markings on the gear. She said something quietly, almost to herself, and then stood and looked at Ryan. She said the equipment was Dretheli commercial grade, the kind available through private contracts rather than official military channels. She said the dialect the leader had used was specifically associated with port regions in Dretheli Outer Territory, where contracted fighters were commonly hired for unofficial operations. Ryan nodded slowly. By the time station security arrived, a full unit of Corati officers in gray armor, moving fast with weapons drawn, the corridor was calm. The Corati security chief came in first, weapon raised, scanning the space. Her name was Selin, and she was experienced enough that her expression did not show surprise easily. But when she lowered her weapon and looked at the 31 restrained attackers lined up against the wall, and then looked at the 5 humans standing quietly in the center of the corridor, her expression shifted into something that was not quite surprise and not quite awe but was somewhere between the two. She counted the attackers. She counted the humans. She looked at the corridor. She counted again. Ryan stepped forward and introduced himself. He said that he was sorry for the disruption and asked if it would be possible to reschedule the afternoon session by 30 minutes, as his team would need a moment to clean up and file an incident report. He said it in the same tone a person might use to ask for a table at a restaurant. Selin stared at him. She said she would speak to the council coordinator. Ryan thanked her and turned back to his delegation, asking Laura if she still had her data pad. Laura held it up. He asked if she had gotten a good look at the attacker's equipment markings. She said she had. He nodded and said to write it all down, every detail, because they were going to need it for the afternoon session. Behind them, Selin stood in the middle of the corridor for a long moment, looking at the row of restrained attackers, and then at the 5 calm humans walking away toward the elevator, and then back at the attackers again. She had been a security officer for 30 years. She had seen many things. She had never seen anything quite like this. She reached for her communication unit and called the council coordinator. She said there was something the council needed to know about the human delegation. She said the word she was looking for was not primitive. She was no longer sure what the right word was, but it was definitely not that. The afternoon session began 35 minutes late. Every seat in the chamber was full again, but the atmosphere was different from the morning. The low murmur that had filled the space before was gone. Delegates sat straighter. Eyes moved more carefully. Word had spread through the station the way word always spread in closed spaces full of intelligent creatures, fast, and with more detail than the original event actually contained. By the time Ryan walked to the platform for the second time, every delegate in the chamber had already heard some version of what had happened in the lower corridor. Some versions were accurate. Some were larger than the truth. All of them had the same ending. 31 attackers. 5 humans. 11 minutes. Nobody dead. Ryan stood at the platform and looked up at the chamber. The expression on his face was the same as it had been that morning, calm, easy, not quite smiling. He set nothing on the display port this time. He folded his hands in front of him and began to speak. He said that before the formal part of his address, he wanted to note an incident that had occurred during the recess. He said it plainly, without drama, the way a person files a report. He said that 31 armed individuals had attacked the human delegation in a corridor on the lower transit level. He said that his security team had handled the situation. He said that all 31 attackers were currently in Conclave security custody, alive and unharmed, and that the equipment they carried and the dialect their leader had used both pointed to a specific origin that the council might find interesting. He paused. He looked directly at Vrethik. He said he would not be making a formal accusation at this time, because that was not what they were here for. He said that humanity appreciated the hospitality of the conclave and had no desire to create a political incident on their first visit. He said that they would, however, be keeping all of the evidence, and that they had a very good memory for this kind of thing. Vrethik did not move. He sat in his delegate seat like a statue, his copper eyes fixed on Ryan, and nothing on his face changed. But the aide sitting beside him shifted in his seat, just slightly, and looked at the floor. Ryan thanked the chamber for its patience and moved on. He said that humanity had come to the conclave with a proposal, and that the proposal was simple. He said that Earth was not asking for charity. It was not asking for protection or guidance or the patience of older civilizations. He said that humanity understood it was young by galactic standards, and that this was fine, because youth had certain advantages that age sometimes forgot it once had. Then he nodded to Laura. She walked to the display port and loaded a second data chip, not the one from the morning, but a new one. What it showed was not a graph of casualties. What it showed was a map. A star map, pulled back far enough that the entire conclave territory was visible as a shaped region in the center, and around it, in unmarked space at the edges, a series of small blue points of light appeared, one by one, spreading out from the area near Earth's solar system like a slow bloom. The chamber went still in a different way than it had gone still before. Before, it had been the stillness of surprise. Now it was the stillness of calculation, the quiet that falls over a room full of intelligent creatures who have all just realized that something they believed was true is not true at all. Each blue point of light was a ship. Laura let that sit for a moment before the technical readout appeared beside each point: vessel class, tonnage, armament, crew capacity. Every vessel on the map was a deep space warship. Not scouts. Not transport vessels. Warships, built for sustained engagement, designed for exactly the kind of long-range independent operation that putting them at the edge of conclave sensor range required. The total count appeared at the bottom of the display. 412 vessels. Not 11,000. Not the kind of number that made a chamber shake. But positioned where they were, in unmarked space, outside any established patrol route, beyond the reach of any conclave early warning system, 412 warships were not a number anyone in the room could dismiss. They were a statement. They said that humanity had been preparing, quietly and patiently, for a very long time. They said that the small, plain shuttle that had docked at the Veth Prime assembly was not representative of what Earth had brought to the conversation. Laura spoke then. She said that the fleet was not a threat. She said it clearly and she meant it, and the way she said it made clear that she knew the distinction between threatening someone and simply letting them know what existed. She said that the fleet was there because Earth had learned, through a great deal of difficult experience, that showing up to any important conversation without the means to protect yourself was not diplomacy. It was hope. And hope, on its own, was not a strategy. She set out humanity's proposal in clear, simple terms. Earth was offering a partnership. Not a transaction, not a temporary arrangement, but a genuine long-term partnership between humanity and the Conclave. In exchange for full and equal standing on the Conclave Council, humanity would contribute its military capability to collective Conclave security. Its strategic knowledge, 3,000 years of conflict analysis, tactical development, and hard-learned lessons about how wars start and how they end, would be made available to any member civilization that requested it. Earth would also open its shipyards to collaborative construction projects and its research institutions to joint scientific programs. The terms were not small. But they were fair. They were precise. And they were, Laura said quietly at the end, not negotiable. The chamber had been holding its collective breath for most of her address. When she finished, the release of that tension moved through the space like a wave. Vrethik rose from his seat. He was even more imposing standing than he was seated, and the chamber recognized it. Other delegates fell quiet. He looked down at Ryan on the platform and spoke in Drethali, his voice deep and carrying easily across the space without amplification. He said that humanity was overreaching. He said that a species with no prior standing in the Conclave, no established history of galactic interaction, and a fleet that was impressive only in its secrecy rather than its size, was in no position to present terms to one of the oldest governing bodies in the known galaxy. He said that the Conclave had been patient with humanity's presentation, but patience had limits, and the appropriate response to an ultimatum from a junior species was not negotiation. He said the word junior the way one says a word they have been saving. Ryan looked up at him for a long, quiet moment. Then he said, "Vrethik. What happened to the last empire that told humanity no?" He did not say it loudly. He did not say it with anger. He said it the way someone asks a genuine question, in a tone that was almost curious, as if he was actually interested in whether Vrethik knew the answer. The chamber was absolutely silent. Vrethik held Ryan's gaze for several seconds. His copper eyes did not blink. His posture did not change. But after a moment, he sat back down. He said nothing further. Ryan turned back to the chamber and thanked the council for their time. He said humanity would be available for formal discussions at the council's convenience, and that his delegation would be in their quarters until then. He said they were looking forward to working with the conclave, and that he meant that sincerely. Then he walked off the platform, and the chamber behind him broke into the loudest sound it had made all day. The vote was held the following morning, and it did not take long. The conclave council chamber was arranged differently for formal votes. The wide observation seating was still full, but the lower floor, where delegates sat during presentations, had been reorganized into a formal circle of chairs, one for each of the 17-member civilizations. Each delegate sat in their assigned place with their advisors behind them, and in the center of the circle the display system showed a simple vote tracker, 17 spaces, each tied to a civilization's marker, each space currently blank. Ryan, Laura, and Derek sat in the observation level above the floor, along one of the lower gallery rows, close enough to see the faces of the delegates clearly. They had not been asked to leave during the vote, which was itself a change from standard conclave procedure. Pip, their small four-armed guide, had quietly told them that morning that the council coordinator had decided to allow the human delegation to observe, which had never been done for a non-member species before. Ryan had thanked Pip and said nothing else. The council president, a long-limbed pale creature named Esaveth from the Korati civilization, called the session to order and laid out the proposal in formal language: full membership in the interstellar conclave for the human species of the planet Earth, inclusive of a permanent seat on the ruling council and all rights, responsibilities, and privileges attached to that standing. She asked each delegation to register their vote. The first 6 votes came in quickly, one after another, all in favor. The Korati voted yes. The Velis voted yes. 4 of the smaller trade civilizations voted yes in quick succession, their markers turning a pale green on the display. Then there was a pause. The next 4 votes were slower. 2 more came in as yes. 1 civilization abstained, a cautious species called the Marith who, Pip had explained earlier, abstained on every vote involving military matters on general principle. 1 voted no. The marker for the Drethali-aligned Kethari civilization turned red, and their delegate did not look up from the floor when it happened. The votes continued. By the time the room reached the 14th vote, the count stood at 11 in favor, 2 opposed, and 1 abstention. Humanity needed a simple majority of the full council, which meant 10 votes. They had already passed that mark. But the session continued, because every civilization had the right to cast its vote regardless of the outcome. The Drethali voted last. Vrethik rose from his seat in the circle to deliver the vote personally, which was unusual. Delegates typically registered through their console. Standing to speak meant he intended to say something beyond the vote itself. The chamber went quiet. He looked at the display, and then he looked up at the gallery where Ryan sat. He said that the Drethali civilization voted against the proposal. He said it without explanation, without the long speech that his rising had suggested, and then he sat back down. His marker turned red. The final count settled on the display: 14 in favor, 3 opposed, 1 abstention. Esaveth announced the result in formal terms and then said something that was not part of the standard script. She said that in her 40 years as a council officer, she had never seen a first-visit species receive 14 votes. She said it quietly, almost to herself, into an open microphone, and the gallery heard it clearly. In the row above the circle floor, Ryan let out a slow breath. Laura had her hand pressed over her mouth and her eyes were bright. Derek sat with his arms folded and his expression unchanged, but he nodded once, in the small, precise way that meant something to the people who knew him. The formal paperwork took the rest of the morning, and the reception that followed was a different kind of event from the summit sessions. It was quieter, more scattered, held in one of the station's large common areas where delegates moved around freely and spoke in smaller groups. Food and drink from a dozen different worlds filled long service tables along the walls, and the noise of 200 conversations happening at once created a warm, busy hum throughout the space. Ryan moved through the reception the same way he moved through everything, at a comfortable pace, taking in the room, stopping when someone approached him and giving them his full attention. Several delegates came to introduce themselves properly for the first time, now that the vote had passed and the political calculation had changed. He spoke with all of them. He was polite. He was direct. He did not say anything that committed humanity to anything beyond what had already been agreed, and he did not say it in a way that made people feel he was being careful with them. He was just being precise. Derek was in a quieter part of the reception hall near one of the side exits when Selen found him. She had changed out of her operational armor and was wearing the simpler uniform that Corati security staff wore during formal occasions. She was shorter out of armor, but no less composed. She crossed the space between them and stood in front of him with the direct manner of someone who had thought about what they wanted to say and decided to simply say it. She asked him how 5 people had neutralized 31 armed fighters without a single serious injury on either side. Derek looked at her for a moment. He said it was not a complicated answer. He said the attackers made an assumption before the fight started. They looked at 5 humans and they calculated the situation based on what they believed 5 humans were capable of. They decided the result before the first move was made. And because they had already decided, they stopped paying full attention to what was actually happening in front of them. Selen said she understood the principle. She said she was asking about the specifics, the techniques, the coordination, the speed. Derek said those things came from practice. He said that humans had been fighting each other in every possible kind of environment for thousands of years, and that some of what they had learned in that time was very efficient. He said it the same way someone might describe a skill they had developed through repetition, like cooking or carpentry. Selen looked at him for a long moment. Then she said she thought her government would be very interested in a formal conversation about training exchange programs. Derek said he would mention it to Ryan. Across the hall, Laura was standing near one of the service tables with a small cup of something the Velis delegate had recommended, which turned out to be sweet and slightly warm and very good. She was talking to a young Merith scientist who had approached her about her xenolinguistic work and had not stopped asking questions for the past 20 minutes. Laura did not mind. This was the kind of conversation she had come here for, not the politics, not the power dynamics, but the simple exchange of knowledge between 2 people from different worlds who were both genuinely curious about the same things. Later that evening, after the reception had ended and the station was settling into its quiet night cycle, the 3 of them stood together at a wide viewport on the upper level of the guest quarters. The stars outside were still. The conclave station stretched out below the viewport, enormous and lit, its docking arms holding ships from a dozen worlds. And beyond it, far out in the dark, the Ardent waited at its berth, small and practical and ready to take them home. Laura asked what came next. Ryan thought about it for a moment. He said there would be a follow-up summit in 6 months, and Earth would need to send a full diplomatic team for that one, not 3 people, but a proper delegation with support staff and specialists. He said the fleet would need to be officially registered in conclave records, which would take time and negotiation. He said there were 3 civilizations whose no votes needed to be understood and eventually, carefully, addressed. He said that getting a seat at the table was the beginning, not the end, and that the work from here would be slower and more complicated than anything they had done in the past 2 days. Laura said that sounded like a lot. Ryan agreed. He said it was. He said that was fine. He said that humanity had been doing complicated things for a very long time. Derek said nothing. He stood at the viewport with his arms folded and looked out at the stars, and his expression was the same quiet, steady thing it always was. But if someone had looked carefully, they might have noticed something in his eyes that had not been there when they arrived, not pride exactly, and not satisfaction exactly, but something close to both. The look of someone who had done what they came to do, and done it the right way. Ryan looked out at the dark and the stars for a long time. They had come here as a joke. A curiosity. Something small and primitive that the galaxy had decided to observe for its own amusement. They had walked in last, and they had been seated at the back, and every eye in the chamber had been waiting for them to stumble. They had not stumbled. They were leaving with a permanent seat on the oldest governing body in the known galaxy, the full attention and respect of 14 civilizations, and a story that would be told in conclave halls for a very long time. Not bad, Ryan thought, for a joke. He finished his coffee, set the cup down, and told the other 2 to get some sleep. They had a long trip home, and there was a lot of work waiting for them when they got there.